Good evening. This is Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, proudly representing the residents of the District of Columbia. On behalf of the DC Bar Foundation and its Young Lawyers Network Leadership Council, I am grateful for all of the supporters who helped make tonight's Avenues to Justice event possible and whose generous contributions will directly support the legal needs of DC residents. We know that addressing these needs comes at a most critical time. Our residents with lowest incomes are bearing the brunt of this public health crisis and have always been subject to unequal access to legal services. Affording our neighbors with the legal representation and assistance they need is fundamental to realizing the nation's promise that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. On behalf of all Washingtonians, I want to thank the DC Bar Foundation for hosting this timely conversation on race, equity, and civil legal aid, and for all of its important work. I hope you will join me in supporting them as they fulfill their mission to ensure that all DC residents have equal access to justice. Thank you again.
Thank you, Congresswoman Holmes Norton, for those inspiring words. Welcome everyone to tonight's Avenues to Justice fundraiser. My name is Meryl Grenadier, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the DC Bar Foundation's Young Lawyers Network Leadership Council, or YLN for short. As the leading funder of civil legal aid in the District of Columbia, the DC Bar Foundation works to fund, support, and improve legal representation for people living in poverty and in vulnerable situations. The foundation launched the YLN in November 2011 to provide young lawyers an opportunity to help further this goal. Our members serve as ambassadors in promoting the foundation's mission and programs, and we also help raise funds to support those efforts. Since joining the YLN, I have come to recognize that the DC Bar Foundation is a visionary organization, dedicated to forming a deep understanding of the challenges DC residents face and looking for ways to address those challenges in a holistic way by supporting underserved communities and the attorneys that provide civil legal services to them. By continually assessing needs and through strategic grant making each year, the foundation moves us closer to a DC where equal access to justice is a reality. On behalf of the entire YLN membership and the DC Bar Foundation, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. Tonight is very different from our traditional annual fundraiser, Lip Sync for Justice. For one, the coronavirus pandemic makes it impossible for us to gather as we normally do. But more importantly, as a group, we also felt that the time we are in demands more of us. So our focus this evening will be on how we can create different pathways to justice. You'll hear from both individuals and organizations who are working towards creating a more equitable legal system in DC and around the country. It is our hope that our program tonight will provide you with some inspiration, some motivation, and hope for the future. And if you are inspired or motivated to make a donation to the DC Bar Foundation during the event, please do so by texting the word avenues in all caps to 43321. That's avenues in all caps to 43321. Finally, this event would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. We'd like to thank the following firms and individuals for their generous support of tonight's event. We're thrilled to report that we've surpassed our fundraising goal from last year and have raised nearly $39,000 in support of the DC Bar Foundation. I would also like to thank our panelists, my YLN co-chair, Courtney Lindsay, our event co-chairs, Ashley James and Melissa Weberman, and everyone who served on the planning committee. Tonight would not be possible without you. I also want to thank the DC Bar Foundation staff for all of your support and encouragement as we re-envision tonight's event. Next, you'll see a short video of the members of the YLN, followed by remarks from DC Bar Foundation Executive Director, Kira Jarrett, before we bring out our esteemed panel. Enjoy the show.
I think it is incredibly important to pay it forward. Being a member of YLNC gives me the opportunity to help legal aid organizations and advocates to give a voice to DC residents who are in need of legal assistance.
I saw firsthand there's an essential need for legal services to preserve access to justice. Providing funding to those who assist vulnerable populations makes those services possible. And the YLNLC allows me the opportunity to work with my peers to promote DCBF's mission and help raise additional resources to support such local legal aid organizations.
YLN is a great opportunity to get to know other young attorneys in the area who are committed to expanding access to justice.
What I love about the DC Bar Foundation is that it takes a holistic look at the legal needs in our community and funds a variety of organizations to meet those needs.
So you're already able to see the impact of DCBF funding because you know those individuals do not have been able to get the kind of services.
Regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, regardless of who they love, and regardless of how much money they have, everyone should have access to justice when they need it.
Having access to justice means to me being able to provide particularly vulnerable residents of DC with help.
Everyone has a basic understanding of their rights and privileges as a human being, and those rights are respected no matter your race, your gender expression, your sexuality, or your socioeconomic status.
Ensuring that all individuals have access to justice means not only offering legal and associated resources to all members of our community, but offering those resources in a manner that works for those to whom they're directed.
Access to justice means that the law supports achieving justice and that mechanisms are available to reach that goal.
Thank you to members of
that we use law, policy, and social activism to ensure that the law is equitably applied for all.
There cannot be justice for everyone until we root out that prejudice, that racism, and create a system that ensures justice is equally applied.
In this country, too often, it seems like we have a justice system for one group and a punishment system for another. As lawyers, it's our responsibility to change that.
I remember being hopeless when right-wing extremists took over my hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia, bearing torches and shouting slurs. When I saw the mix of people, the different types of people who were joining in to fight for the rights of me, the rights of my siblings, the rights of my family, the rights of my friends, for the first time, I felt hopeful that things will be different. But those things will only be different if we all join together and keep fighting, even when things get messy, even when things get uncomfortable.
Just do something. Get off the bench, do one small thing every day. It can be working on a pro bono case. It can be educating yourself or someone else. Knowledge is power.
And so I think it's really important for people to speak up about the laws that are impacting the way that people of color are being treated.
Vote and volunteer to support voter registration efforts and election protection efforts.
Give to organizations like DCBF, which does great work for so many. It allows your dollar to go so far to help many organizations to make sure that everyone has access to justice, no matter your color, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, no matter what.
Thank you to the members of the Young Lawyers Network Leadership Council for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us in that really amazing and inspirational video. Special thanks to Rebecca Irvin and her team at Arnold & Porter for pulling the video together. My name is Kira Jarrett, and I am the CEO of the DC Bar Foundation. Tonight's event would not have been possible without Melissa Weberman and Ashley James and the entire Leadership Council for their focus, their determination, and their flexibility as we navigated the pandemic and worked to create a program that seemed right for the time in which we find ourselves. The foundation is committed to transforming the civil legal aid network of the district so that everyone has a fair and equal legal experience. The foundation invests in justice by supporting various players in the civil legal network and by encouraging greater coordination in the delivery of services. For example, this year we worked with 6 of our housing law grantees to create a single phone line for tenants facing eviction so that they can quickly get the legal help they need. 2020 has been an interesting year, and like many other members of the district's legal aid network and our larger community, the DC Bar Foundation has made major shifts since March. Our whole team has worked remotely since then, and we will continue to do so for some time. Fortunately, we've been able to continue almost all of our work over the last several months without little interruption. But unfortunately, we have seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the communities that we serve. We have awarded $135,000 in COVID-19 response grants to 9 of our legal aid organizations in the district. And these grants have ranged from $5,000 to $25,000, and they have focused on the areas of public benefits, employment law, and family law. In just a few minutes, you'll hear from one of our grantees, Karen Newton-Cole, from the Neighborhood Legal Services Program. And later, we'll learn from Aja Taylor about how Bread for the City, another of our grantees, is creating lasting impact in the district. Before I pass the mic to Attorney General Racine, I would like to again thank our generous corporate and individual sponsors, our grantees, and many more supporters of civil legal aid. Your support made this event possible. And I also want to thank former members of the Leadership Council. We reached out to them and they generously donated nearly $1,400 to add to the total that Meryl mentioned earlier. To those of you who are new to our family, I hope you will consider making a charitable donation by texting the word Avenues, AVENUES, to 44321. Your support will help ensure a healthy, vibrant, and coordinated civil legal aid network that continues to serve communities of color and the most vulnerable in DC. To see how your support will help, I now invite you to watch a short 2-minute video featuring Karen Newton-Cole and the work of the Neighborhood Legal Services Program. Thank you again for joining us tonight. After the video, Attorney General Karl Racine will moderate a timely discussion with Dana Bowen Matthew, DeRay McCusson, and Aja Taylor about race, equity, and transforming the civil legal aid network so that all residents can have a fair and equal legal experience.
Hello, my name is Karen Newton-Cole, and I am the Executive Director of Neighborhood Legal Services Program of the District of Columbia. I want to talk a little bit today about the DC Bar Foundation. The DC Bar Foundation has been a long-term supporter of Neighborhood Legal Services Program. They have supported many of our projects and programs, and they have allowed us to extend our services to a greater number of DC residents in need. The DC Bar Foundation has supported a program that is called the Civil Legal Counsel Projects Program, or better known as the Eviction Prevention Program. That particular program allows us to help DC residents and prevent eviction. Particularly with regard to neighborhood legal services, what we do is we give them extended representation in the court systems, and our whole goal is to prevent eviction. This particular program is also a collaborative program. It's a program that involves 5 other sister organizations. Those organizations come together along with Neighborhood Legal Services Program, and we sit down and we talk about strategies. How do we prevent eviction? How do we get the best our clients can possibly get from the system? We want to combat injustices that are embedded in the system. We want to combat inequities that are visited upon our clients based upon racial pieces. One of the things that we have done through COVID-19 is come together more closely as a group. And we've established a single point of contact, which has been the landlord and tenant land, or LNT land as we call it. That single point of contact allows people who are threatened or who need housing help to call the landline and get one of the legal services organizations. And if one legal services organization can't help them, another will help them. All of this has been possible through the DC Bar Foundation.
Good evening. My name is Ashley James, and along with Melissa Weberman, I've had the pleasure of co-chairing tonight's event. Thank you again to our sponsors, our host committee, and most of all you for joining us. I want to provide a quick update on tonight's fundraising effort. Our text campaign has already resulted in over $40,000 in donations when combined with previous donations. I know we can do more. Please just text the word avenues in all caps to 44321. Again, that's avenues to 44321. I also have the pleasure of introducing our panel. Leading the panel or the discussion is Washington, D.C.'s own Attorney General Karl Racine. A.G. Racine was sworn in as the District of Columbia's first elected Attorney General in 2015 and re-elected to that position in 2018. He brings over 25 years of legal and leadership experience. Over the course of his career, he has worked with the DC Public Defender Service and served as Associate White House Counsel to President Bill Clinton. While in private practice, he was elected managing partner of his firm, Venable LLP, and became the first African-American managing partner of a top 100 American law firm. Joining A.G. Racine are Dean Dana Bowen Matthew, DeRay McKesson, and Aja Taylor. Dean Dana Bowen Matthew is the first woman to lead George Washington University School of Law. She's a nationally recognized lawyer and legal scholar with 3 decades of industry and academic experience. Dana is also an expert in health equity and public health policy with a passion for public service. DeRay McKesson is a civil rights activist focused primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. Spurred by the death of Mike Brown and the subsequent protest, DeRay has become a key player in the work to confront the systems and structures that have led to mass incarceration and police killings of Black and other minority populations. He is also the host of the award-winning weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which you should definitely check out. Last, but certainly not least, Aja Taylor joined Bread for the City, a DC Bar Foundation grantee, as a community organizer in the Community Lawyering Project in 2012. She became the organization's first ever advocacy director in the fall of 2015. In this role, Aja oversees Bread for the City's affordable housing campaign, including managing a staff of 5 community organizers. This accomplished panel has achieved quite a few firsts and is well positioned to lead a thoughtful and educational discussion. We are grateful to each of you for joining tonight's event and look forward to hearing more. Over to you, A.G. Racine.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for your kind and generous introduction. And thanks to all of you who've joined us for this discussion today. Before I get started, I want to thank the DC Bar Foundation and its Young Lawyers Network Leadership Council for hosting tonight's event and for your work every day to support legal aid for vulnerable district residents. This year, we've watched as the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated deep inequities in employment, healthcare, education, and housing, just to name a few. These inequities have been particularly stark here in the district, where we've seen unemployment grow fastest in our poorest wards, and where nearly 75% of the 632 residents who have lost their lives to the virus were African American. That same systematic racism was at work when police killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that has become impossible to ignore. Over this summer, we've seen a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-geographic movement emerge, demanding that America finally make good on its founding promise that all people are created equal. Conversations about race and justice often turn immediately to the criminal justice system, and for good reason. There clearly is urgent work to be done there. But we also need to focus and talk about the barriers so many people of color and our poor communities, immigrants, and vulnerable residents still face in accessing healthcare, housing, employment, education, and so much more. The DC Bar Foundation, thankfully, focuses on breaking down some of these barriers by supporting the district's civil legal aid. The district's civil legal aid network helps families access basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and education. It helps victims of domestic violence find safety when people have been discriminated against in employment or scammed by unscrupulous businesses achieve economic security. So tonight's conversation will focus on race, equity, and how civil legal aid contributes in the fight to ensure justice for all. So let me jump right in with our questions for our panelists. And of course, we invite viewers to submit questions and otherwise engage with us. Dr. Mathieu, access to healthcare is important, and we know that it's important more than ever right now. You've spent a lot of your career becoming an expert in this subject. What is the connection between the barriers people with low incomes face accessing healthcare and inequities in the legal system? How can the legal community help break down these barriers to access healthcare? And is there anything that can and should be done right now amid this pandemic to increase access to care? Dr. Mathieu, start us off.
Thank you kindly, A.G. Racine. Thank you also to the DC Bar, the Young Lawyers Group. Thank you to Camilo Ramirez, my colleague at Brookings, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this esteemed panel. It does an old woman's heart good to be a part of the conversation with these very, very famous young people. I'm going to try and keep up. But let me start by talking about why health is so important. And if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to do a little bit of data to let you know that there has never been a single year in the history of the United States in which Black people, specifically African Americans, have not been sicker and died quicker than whites, not a single year in our history. And your question about whether there is a connection or why there is a connection between that fact and access to justice has three answers. The very reasons that that statistic and that fact is true is because of law. Because law constructed every single institutional barrier that affects health. Now, your question is about access to health, but let me very respectfully say that healthcare access is the tip of the iceberg, and it's the tip of the structures that have created that tragic fact. The fact is that we had to create the criminal justice system that we live with today, and we created it before the country was founded, and we created it by institutionalizing white supremacy that affects our health today. So by way of example, there was a law in 1698, and I'm just giving you one law, it's one of many, a law in 1698, which said that if a Black person resists their master and their correction, and they should happen to die, that is not a felony. Why? Because Black people are obstinate and need correction. That was the law in 1698, and I dare say that is the law today. That is the reason that if you think about last night's debate and all of the issues that were discussed on that stage, they were all about these structures that were created by law. I'm going to go ahead and use the term structural racism. How did racism become structural? It became structural by law. And it is that legally constructed, legally created, and legally maintained racism that continues to kill us today. So I say that law created and maintained these inequities called structural racism to point out that law is required, access to justice is requisite in order to dismantle them. The only way that we will change all of the systemic or institutional racism that kills us and that keeps us sicker than whites is by dismantling the legal institutions that created them. So there was reference made to eviction, right? Housing, disparate housing makes us sicker than whites structurally. Why do blacks make 65 cents on the dollar of a white person? Because of the law's failure to enforce equal justice in employment. Why is it that a black mother is 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than a white mother? It is because of structural racism that the law has constructed that makes her life harder to weather than white women's lives in housing, in food, in recreation, in education. So I'm a black mother. I'm going to give you one more example, and I know you're going to interrupt me in a second because I get going, and I'm really very sorry, but the data is compelling in my view. I'm a black mother, and every mother is afraid when their 16-year-old gets ready to go drive. Every mother is afraid. So they're afraid they're going to make a wrong turn. They're afraid they're going to drive poorly. They're afraid they're going to leave the keys in the car. But add to that I am afraid that if my child gets stopped by the police, that child will not come home except in a box, right? So I bear that fear every single time that my 16-year-old child goes out the door. That is the reason that Black mothers, no matter what their income or education is, are likely to lose their babies in the first year of life 2.5 times more frequently than white mothers. What's the fix? The fix is dismantling structural racism. How can you do it? You have to have laws that change eviction. You have to have laws, tax laws have to be enforced and changed in order to change the income gap, the wealth gap, the housing ownership gap. And I'll end by saying that courageous lawyers will be required to do the ultimate fix, which is reparations. And I do believe that reparations are required in order to reverse structural racism. And that's why access to justice is absolutely essential to changing the fact that we die quicker and live sicker than whites.
Powerful. Ladies and gentlemen, we're throwing fastballs tonight, right down the center of the plate. We're not going to mince words, and we're going to talk about real issues as Dr. Matthew just did. One point of clarification, Dr. Matthew, with all due respect, you're not an old lady. You are young at heart, young at spirit, and your brain is obviously on tonight. Thank you. Let me go to DeRay. DeRay, I wonder whether you want to comment on what you just heard before I ask my question, DeRay.
No, I'll comment in an answer to your question. But
go ahead, brother.
I second everything I heard.
Excellent. So look, you've been involved deeply in community organizing and civil rights around this country. And obviously you're a big player in the BLM movement. You've written extensively and deeply. Tell us how you have observed some of the inequities in the civil legal system, similar to perhaps what you've seen in the criminal justice system. And how has the lack of access to civil justice impacted the communities that you're working deeply in?
Yeah, so when I think about what the dean said, I'm always reminded that systems are a function of the choices that people made, right? Police are choosing to kill people. Doctors are choosing not to treat Black women. people set up these institutions, like people pass these laws. There's a choice to make racist laws and to carry them in. So as much as we talk about institutions, it's never lost on me that people allowed this to happen. So when we think about even today, I'm reminded that there are judges and there are lawyers who we still need to deprogram the racism and the bias out of them when they make decisions every day. That like, this is, people are choosing to replicate this. The system doesn't just do it on its own, right? Like people uphold the system, people empower it, people enable it. The second thing is this idea of as organizers, we often talk about the difference between consequence and punishment, that a consequence is set up so that you change your behavior, a punishment is set up so that you experience pain. And so much of what the criminal justice system is, it is rooted in punishment. And what we realize is that so much of that punishment actually carries over into how people are unable to access civil services for the long haul. So what happens when, there are 2 million people incarcerated in a given year. A lot of people don't realize that there are 10 million people, though, who go in and out of prisons and jails in a given year. And what we find is that so many people upon exiting, they don't know whether they can vote. They don't know, can they get health care? Or if they can get health care, is it 60 days? Is it 90 days? Is it 120 days? Can they live in public housing? Can they finally get access to SNAP resources, right? So I think about the civil legal aid system, I'm mindful that the reason why the capacity is so strained, the reason why the need is so big is partly because we have created the conditions that require a response in the first place, right? That so many of the people who are screwed over by the criminal justice system later on need help from lawyers and all these other people so they don't get hurt even more. And I think about issues like immigration. There are so many people who are afraid to access parts of the system because we've seen ICE bear down on them. We've seen people threaten to hurt them as they try to advocate for themselves. So a reminder that like people uphold this and people enable this system every single day. And the third is, as the dean spoke about, I spend much of my time on policing. And it is this reminder that a third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer. That when we think about 2019 was the first year ever where Black people were more afraid of being killed by an officer than being killed by community violence. We think about this as much as an issue of criminal justice as we do a public health issue. And we all should be fighting to end public health issues like this. So I'm interested in how the civil legal space will understand not only its responsibility to helping people in crisis around these civil issues, but also helping to end the pipeline that is creating the crisis in the first place.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to Aja, and I want to refer back to Matthew Diamond's great book, Evicted. There's so many punishing and withering statistics in that book that of course focuses on the housing crisis and evictions that came about after the Great Recession in the 2008, 2009, 2010 time period. Oh my goodness, do we know that a tsunami of evictions, if allowed to occur, will occur once we start to get through this pandemic. The DC Bar Foundation funds a great not-for-profit organization in the District of Columbia called Bread for the City, and its housing and anti-eviction work. Aja, tell us about the work and how it has shifted in the last 6 months. What are the biggest challenges and greatest areas of need right now that lawyers and others, friends on this call, can do to help our most vulnerable residents?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So before I answer your question, I actually want to name some names. So Jamal Byrd, Daquan Young, Marquise Alston, Jeffrey Price, Trey Joyner, Terrence Sterling.
Aja, you're on mute, sorry.
Raphael Briscoe and Dion Kay. So the names that I just listed are, I'm on calls all the time, especially recently, where folks are rightfully angered and moved into action by the senseless murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. But right here in DC, the Metropolitan Police Department has also engaged in senseless murders of Black folks. But we don't often speak their names. And so I didn't want to be in a space, be on a panel talking about a city that I love and not talk about people who are no longer here because of the public health crisis of police violence. To the question of evictions, which, as you know from an earlier conversation, I also see as inextricably linked to the conversation around police violence. Bread for the City does really incredible work. Shout out to our attorneys who actually just recently were part of a coalition effort to push the DC Council to authorize some really critical things when it comes to eviction. So landlords not being able to sue anyone for eviction if they owe less than $600, landlords having to provide photographic proof of the things that they say they're suing tenants over, and a laundry list of other things. I really encourage folks. I think our attorneys will be coming out with some like know your rights stuff so that people know of some of the new things coming through in eviction laws. But the bottom line is for us at Bread for the City, for our attorneys, and I think this should be the case for attorneys everywhere. One, we operate on the premise that housing is a human right. So no one should be denied access to housing that is safe, healthy, and that they can afford, regardless of their ability to pay. Regardless of their race, obviously, regardless of any of those immutable characteristics. What we know is that people deserve a place to live, and eviction is based wholly in the commodification of land and housing. And what I mean when I say that is this idea that in order to deserve housing, you must be able to pay for it. And somehow, if you're not able to pay for housing, you are not worthy of housing. That isn't what we believe at Bread for the City. That isn't what we believe in coalitions that I'm a part of, like the Fair Budget Coalition, like the Cancel the Rent campaign. It's not what my comrades at BLM DC or BYP 100 believe. What we know is that everyone deserves a place to live, and evictions are inhumane. And so what you said, I'm really encouraged by what you said, AG Carl Racine, in terms of if it's allowed to happen. So the Cancel the Rent campaign right now is talking about what it means to cancel back rent for everyone. And at Bread for the City, our organizing, especially for public housing residents, has long time been a moratorium on evictions, because what we know in public housing is that in DC, but also in Baltimore, in cities across the country, housing authorities are moving to redevelop land, and they're moving to do it in ways that displace people, and they're still expecting people to pay rent. So in DC, we have folks living with mold, living with pests, right? Roaches and rats that are so many that they should be paying some rent on it. They should get something on it, right? And what we know is that the housing authority, the DC Housing Authority run by Director Tyrone Garrett, still expects people to pay rent, still expects to evict people based on non-payment of rent, right? And what does that mean? All that does is cycle people back through a system. You look at agencies like in DC, DHS, which is the Department of Human Services, who all of these great things that I was talking about at the beginning in terms of eviction, making evictions less likely for people coming out on the other side of this pandemic. DHS, which is supposed to be an institution or an agency helping prevent homelessness, right? Like helping folks who are experiencing homelessness, came out publicly in opposition of those things, right? And it makes you wonder, well, if the government is supposed to be a government of the people and working for the people, then why does it allow those sorts of things to happen, right? What is the responsibility? Like, yes, nonprofits, thankful for the support of the DC Bar Foundation, and thankful for the resources for our attorneys to go and kick butt in court, but honestly, like people shouldn't be in eviction court to begin with, right? And what is the onus of people in government, people getting paid, people who've been elected to represent all people, not just people with wealth or people with resources? What is the onus on the government, and that's both elected officials and agency officials, to do what's necessary to make sure that their programs, their policies, their priorities are people-centered and are, that show that they fundamentally believe that housing is a human right.
Awesome. And I think by extension, what you're telling folks is that in addition to helping groups like the DC Bar Foundation that helps your team, we also need lawyers and professionals to step up and advocate in their halls of legislation, the council, for better laws. That's another way we can get right and help our people. Thank you so much. Back to Dr. Matthew. Dr. Matthew, you were a professor over in Charlottesville where you got your law degree. I know that in your professorship there, you worked really hard to bring academia into the community to actually help residents in and around the Charlottesville area. Are you seeking to replicate that now that you're at George Washington University? And how can law students and young lawyers contribute to that kind of increasing equity effort?
I appreciate the question very much because I'm only 2 months into the deanship, and I want everybody to know that yes, indeed, I do intend to make as much trouble here as I made it. Right?
Good trouble.
Trouble, necessary trouble. The Equity Institute that I hope to build here mirrors the Equity Center down at the University of Virginia, where we both went to school, Attorney General Racine. And the theory is that a university is an anchor institution that not only created the inequality that Asia and Bread for the City has to dismantle, but we maintain it. We are the largest employer in an area usually paying less than a living wage. We are the largest procurers, usually buying what we buy from other than Black and women-owned businesses. We have a profound impact, especially if, like the University of Virginia and the George Washington University, we have a health institution. We have a profound impact on the access or lack thereof to health and healthcare. And lastly, but not least, we educate people. That is, we admit students and educate them as what I consider to be a political act. When you admit a student and give them opportunity to become educated, to get a law degree, to get an engineering degree, to go out and become civil servants and leaders of society, when you do so as disproportionately as these historically non-Black institutions, non-Latinx institutions have done, then you create and replicate the same structural racism that we're all here trying to dismantle piece by piece. So what's the answer? Anchor institutions have to educate students to be engaged so that it's not only the pressures that are on the Legal Aid Society, but we are volunteering, giving our knowledge, giving our energy, giving our work back to the communities that we have literally stripped of their rights and other resources in order to make us great. Now, how did UVA become great? How did George Washington University become great? We were built by the hands of enslaved people for free. After we were built by those hands, if you look not too far into the history, all of the training for the medical and scientific research that was done on Black and brown bodies for free. All of the training that we are giving people now, as I said, is a political act. And if we are not training them to change and reverse structural racism, we are simply perpetuating it. That's why I see the responsibility of higher education to be central to the dismantling of structural racism, of structural inequality. And I hope to build that Equity Institute here as we did at UVA.
Thank you so much. Aja, back to you. You had very specific ideas and objectives. Cancel rent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we talk about canceling rent, there is a big pot of money that would ordinarily have gone to landlords that wouldn't go to landlords. Would you be in favor of ideas like perhaps a one-time tax benefit to the landlords to defray the rent that they're not getting? In other words, shifting the burden of that bucket of money that's not going into the rents now in light of moratoriums to all of us, DC residents as taxpayers, not just putting that solely on the landlords nor the tenants. And then I'm interested in other ideas that you have, Aja, and the community, of course, that you interact with in order for us to make sure that our most vulnerable residents don't get stuck with the bill out in the cold, not being able to protect their kids, who are the ones who suffer the most when evicted?
Yeah, so I think I'll actually start by saying, so at Bread for the City, the average person that we serve, the average income of the folks we serve is $10,000 a year. So when you talk about what it means to have to pay rent, even when you're talking about 30% of the area median income, even that is too expensive, which is why in my initial comments, which is why I said housing should be decommodified, right? So a landlord's sole money-making or their sole proprietorship should not be someone else's housing. They should not be dependent on a person's housing should not be dependent on a profit motive. That being said, to your question of a tax break, I think that, which oddly felt like a candidate debate question, but I was like, okay. But
I'm trying to get you to run for office. That's what it is.
Please don't. It won't happen. But the Cancel the Rent campaign has a ton of excellent ideas, including some that are about making sure that landlords are whole, because at the end of the day, what we care most about is making sure that residents aren't evicted. Now, when you have council members who do things like refuse to have people paying an extra $45 a year, which could have given us money, or refusing, I mean, the Metropolitan Police Department has about a $500 million pot of money. And I could think of 500 million other things to spend that money on, rather than, good PR for them to justify the murder of Deon Kay. We could be spending that money on making sure that people have access to safe, healthy housing that they can afford. To the question of, so whether it's a tax rebate, I don't care. Someone who's getting evicted, is it like, oh yeah, is it a tax rebate, or is it someone giving my landlord a check? So one of the other good things that happened recently that DHS was also opposed to was an expansion of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP, to make it so that people can just attest. So you don't have to have this whole entire burden of proof where you have to come beg and plead. I want to actually shout out the DC Mutual Aid Society, which has been doing really beautiful modeling of what it means for neighbors to come be in solidarity with other neighbors. That's not in a charity model, not in a model that makes you, show your sores and say oh, I'm so poor and this is why you have to give me these things. But that says, yeah, you deserve housing because you're a person, and you deserve housing because you're a human and you deserve those things. I feel like that answered at least the first question. And then, my ideas for how to make sure evictions don't happen, honestly, is to decommodify the land. If public housing were expanded, you look at countries like Singapore, you look at countries like Zanzibar, you look at cities like Zanzibar, you look at places across the world where there is public housing. In Singapore, it's state of the art. Where it is government owned and operated, and people are living in homes that are healthy. You have the $100,000 person, and the $5,000 person who are living together. And it's this whole idea of, an ability to mix incomes, I guess, which is, supposedly the goal of a lot of these programs, but that really are about erasing Black people and erasing Black culture in a way that expanding and destigmatizing public housing wouldn't have to be. And so I think that the city really the DC, but then all across the country, because this housing crisis is national, it is not just local or even regional, need to really seriously start paying attention to a federal government that is consistently divesting from housing in general, except for their continued subsidization of the suburbs. But they're divesting from affordable housing, and it's a cue for municipalities and localities to step it up.
Thank you so much. DeRay, in the criminal world, we've got the lessons of Gideon and the right to counsel, even if you cannot afford one. We don't have that civil Gideon in most jurisdictions in the United States. How does expansion of Gideon into the civil realm help advance the ball around social justice and racial justice on an economic scale? In other words, how are vulnerable communities hurt by the fact that invariably, notwithstanding great organizations like AJA's, the fact is most folks living in vulnerable communities do not have a civil lawyer for most of their needs in a country where, to be candid, most people need a lawyer at some point or another at a critical time in their lives.
Yes. So much of my work is focused on how do we make sure that bad thing never happens in the first place? Like that's actually what we believe justice is. So when people talk about justice and accountability, especially around police violence, accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the idea that the trauma shouldn't be. So when I hear these conversations about evictions, which are robust and really powerful, I'm thinking in the organizing work that I do that like, who does the evictions? Sheriffs in most places do the evictions, or like it's not normally like the local police. It is like the marshals or the sheriffs, and like they could actually make the choice not to. They could just not do it. And most sheriffs are elected, and we could actually, there are a lot of levers that we could do to remove the power to evict people, to make it so that they couldn't actually force people out of their homes. Like there are a lot of mechanisms on the front end that we could actually do to make sure this trauma never meets people at their door in the way that it does right now. So when I think about the right to counsel, that is definitely a part of it. I'm also mindful that we could actually just like refashion this whole system really quickly, actually, especially around the people who enforce these things that we spend all of our time, who is kicking people out of public housing, who are like, the police are a nexus. People ask me all the time, they're like, why do you focus so much on the police? Like there are all these other issues. And I'm like, name 3 ways you get to prison or jail that don't include the police. You can't, right? The police are not like an ancillary part of this. They are actually like they are the key. They are the people. It is some policing apparatus that's doing the evictions. It's somebody policing that is like taking you to court when you have like defrauded SNAP or whatever they're saying you're doing. Like this is an ancillary. So when I think about the right to counsel, it is important, especially for the civil work. There's so many people who have no clue like how the system should be working for them. And that's not their fault. Like part of our responsibility is to tell people, nope, you deserve this. And I'm here to help you get every single ounce of what you deserve. And I'm here to fight with you for it. And like, I think that has to be a part of the conversation. I'm hopeful, I do worry that we don't spend enough time thinking about like the judges, and we probably spent more time because of Trump recently, but there are a lot of judges pre-Trump who were nightmares in people's community, and people knew it. They were the people signing these warrants. They were the people allowing the evictions. Like we need to focus on judges as much as we need to focus on prosecutors, as much as we need to focus on the police. Like I firmly believe that a full court press is the only way that we'll win. That like, an incremental strategy that's sort of like one thing at a time, we just won't win that way. It'll be all of the strategies working in concert with each other, like a full court press that'll get us across the finish line.
Totally.
Can I make one comment? So, and I don't know that this was your intention, DeRay, but like, yeah, I don't want more humane evictions. So like, I don't care if it's like your Meemaw coming to evict me. There's like nothing not traumatic about being evicted, whether it's like super nice or not. Like there's nothing not traumatic about having to go to eviction court and like prove your worthiness. And like, yeah, not having your stuff put outside is like better. And I agree that like there are ways to decrease the number of interactions that police have with folks. But I worry about in conversations about anti-eviction that quickly, and I think that this is like relevant to the conversation about civil legal services, that like very quickly turn to like, how can we make the eviction process as humane as possible? And for me, evictions are fundamentally inhumane, right? It's like asking someone like a nice way to kick your ass. It's like, actually would just rather you not, right? And so I really would love for like attorneys who are really thinking about how to be impactful in eviction defense work. And one of the reasons I really do appreciate attorneys at Bread for the City, at Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, at Neighborhood Legal Services Program, is because, yeah, it's like, yes, right? Like there's eviction defense because like you're at risk of eviction right now, and having an attorney is going to be your best bet in court, like to your point, like once this bad thing is already happening. But for me, how do we prevent the bad thing from happening isn't just about like the physicalness or like the carceral nature of eviction, but it's also like, why are we living in a place, why are we living in a nation so rich, a city so rich, $15 billion, and the number of people who are homeless, who die every year, outnumber. So like under Bowser, I think it's like something like maybe 22 people who have been murdered by cops versus like 300 or 400 who have died just by virtue of not having a home, right?
Point taken. Excellent point.
So
just look at my clock real quick. We've got 3 minutes. I want to go back to DeRay, and then I'll go back to Dr. Matthew. Go ahead, DeRay.
So we don't disagree, right? I think that this is like a both and. What I'm saying is that today we could actually severely limit and end the power of sheriffs to even execute these things. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that so much of my work is rooted in harm reduction as we dismantle these systems. So in the same way that I believe in the end of solitary confinement, knowing that the end of solitary confinement is not the end of incarceration, is that a good thing? Absolutely, right? So when I think about the work around sheriffs, I am dealing with sheriff's departments all across the country who are doing the most inhumane things to people every day. And they have the legal right to do it, but they also have, we can restrict that right and the power to execute those things in the first place. And I think that's a good thing. I think we can't do that alone, that it has to be in concert with the much bigger conversation about what we both agree on, which is that people just deserve the right to be in homes. We shouldn't be, in Desmond's book, he talks about the people who we were just like taking people's doors off. Like that is wild. And we can actually just like restrict the police from executing any of that stuff. That is a possibility that could be done like tomorrow. And I believe that work too is a part of this.
Thank you very much, DeRay. We're going to go to Dr. Matthew. We got about a minute left. Dr. Matthew, leave us off here with some practical suggestions as to what our audience might do to contribute to the severe needs that communities have right now.
I welcome the opportunity because I'm talking to an audience of lawyers, I presume, and I'm going to riff off of what my brilliant co-panelists have talked about in order to go from the specific to the general. When I'm listening to Asia talk, I'm sorry.
Aja.
You're
good.
Sorry, I have a niece named Asia. Sorry. Aja, when I listen to Asia talk about what the eviction attorneys are doing in Bread for the City and elsewhere, I think to myself, you know what, we need more attorneys doing that, and we need more attorneys enforcing the laws that actually put these people in the position that they're in. That put these people in the position of being homeless because they are mentally ill.
Right.
And using the police as a way to control a health problem, a public health problem in the first place. We need to use the legal talent in this audience to enforce building codes that put people in roach, rat infested, the existing laws, right, that are supposed to be enforced to help people who are housed insufficiently, unsafely, and inhumanely. And then we could take the laws that are right now putting children into juvenile detention instead of executing restorative justice. A.G. Racine, you know this very well. We are doing the school to prison pipeline day in and day out by treating people disparately by race, disparately by sexual orientation, disparately by their mental and physical illnesses, or abilities rather. And we're putting them into a pipeline instead of restorative justice. When I think about what DeRay has been talking about, I think about the fact that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Section 2 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act are being dismantled right now so that we cannot replace the sheriffs that are doing this involuntarily. So if nobody believes that voting is important, let me tell you right now that all of the laws that are required to change the inequities, to change the inequalities that I have talked about in terms of making us sicker and quicker, all of those laws require lawyers, attorneys who are committed to justice. And if you don't do it, I don't know who will. Title VI, the Voting Rights Act, they're under attack. And they would be very helpful if they were not neutralized. They would be very helpful in replacing these sheriffs, changing the eviction laws, changing the pollution laws, changing the employment laws, changing the wealth gap. We have to change the law, and the people in this audience can do it.
Thank you very much. And when we mean voting, you're not only talking about the national elections, You're also talking about where the rubber meets the road. And I know that Aja and DeRay were talking about it too. It's local is where it's at also. I believe our time is at its limit, unfortunately. I commend this panel, and I do commend the group of audience here to go look at the bios of this extraordinary panel. And what you'll find is that actions speak louder than words. Their words were powerful. Their actions are even more powerful. Thank you so much for devoting your time tonight. And I'll turn it back over to my host at the foundation.
Well, thank you so much, Carl, and to all of our panelists. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I'm Melissa Weberman, and along with Ashley James, I co-chaired tonight's event. What an inspiring evening. I mean, on a personal note, I've been working on the YLN's yearly fundraiser each year for a while now. And an in-person networking event where we all drank and hung out and sang karaoke, you know, re-envisioning that into a virtual event that was consistent with the issues and the seriousness of the times was hard. So, you know, Carl, Dana, DeRay, Aja, you're the real reason that we pulled this off and made it such a success. So thank you again for all of your thoughts. I thought the connections that you all drew between civil issues like access to healthcare, access to affordable housing and eviction issues, and criminal and police issues and race were just incredibly interesting. I mean, I was really inspired by your really good conversation. And to our viewers, if you were inspired by what you heard tonight, I hope you'll consider donating to the DC Bar Foundation. You know, it's as simple as texting the word avenues to 44321. Again, that's avenues to 44321. Your support will allow the foundation to continue to ensure that residents of the district have equal access to justice regardless of income. Just so everybody knows, we've already raised almost $41,300 for tonight's fundraiser. So, you know, keep it coming. We will continue to, you know, accept this avenues to 44321 for a while. You can keep donating. So that concludes our program this evening. Thank you again to our individual and corporate sponsors and to you at home for joining us. Good night.